Last time we organized the home front, and the United States became the arsenal of democracy. Today, we're going to see what it's all been for. We're going to see the American experience during the greatest war in human history, the Second World War. And to be honest, I'm bound to disappoint you if I haven't already. Because I mentioned that people tend to know a lot about World War II, as opposed to, for example, Reconstruction, where Americans really don't know anything about it. But no, Americans know a lot about World War II, and we tend to get excited about the nuances. We want to talk about the King Tiger tank and how huge and awesome it was as a technical achievement. Or maybe your cup of tea is talking about mythical Russian flying tanks. Or maybe you like talking about the great personalities and commanders of the war. You want to talk about who would win a staring contest, Russia's Marshal Georgy Zhukov or General George Blood and Guts Patton. Or maybe your experience with World War II comes through first-person shooter games, and you would really like to tell me that Battlefield 5 is the worst game ever, and Call of Duty World War II is where it's at. Or vice versa. Or maybe you're like me, and you just want to talk about Mad Jack Churchill, the British commando who actually shot Germans with a longbow and charged into battle wielding a broadsword, and famously got a German to surrender to him by simply talking loudly at him. Or maybe you want to talk about the big battles. And in the course of human history, no war does battles like World War II, especially if you're looking at the Eastern Front, where you have battles like Kursk and Pokrovka, where you have the largest tank engagements in history. I don't talk about any of them. And yes, it's because I'm a terrible teacher, but it's also because the more you get into the nitty gritty and the more you focus on the individual battles, the less clear picture you get about the story of the war itself. And to be honest, I love talking about World War II nuances and details as much as anybody else. I've logged in enough hours in Hearts of Iron 4 that I think I've earned that street cred. That being said, there's very few battles, except for the ones that we will talk about, that really affect the outcome demonstrably. And that says more about the scale of World War II than anything else. Like, for example, if you look at the Eastern Front, this is just a map here. So this is the Baltic Sea, and this goes all the way down to the Black Sea. Bordering the Soviet Union and Turkey. That's a big chunk of territory right there. And this is a line that shows where the front lines are. In other words, you have German and Soviet armies facing each other across thousands of miles. And they are, in many cases, they're fighting all along that front line. And so, yeah, you can talk about the Battle of Kursk, you can talk about the Battle of the Rzhev Pocket, you can talk about a number of battles, but it's just a drop in the bucket. And I think that that should kind of humble us, and that should make us realize how significant World War II actually is in terms of its size. So, the way I'm going to open things up is to mention that the United States joins the war in December 1941 after Japan attacks the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and then Nazi Germany declares war on the United States. So the situation, in Europe at least, is that the Soviet Union is on its last legs. In December of 1941, right around the time of Pearl Harbor, German tanks were stopped right outside of Moscow but I mean right outside of Moscow. German tank crews reported that they could see the steeples of St. Basil's Cathedral in the distance. That just kind of tells you how close it came. Most of the Soviet Union's territory, at least in the western part, the most populous and industrialized parts of the Soviet Union, was occupied by the German army and its many European allies. The Italians sent troops to fight alongside the Germans. And even countries like Spain, by the way, who weren't formally part of the Axis Pact, still sent troops to fight against the Russians because of the fact that many European governments were still deeply suspicious of the Soviet Union, and in some cases, Hitler appeared to be the lesser of two evils. Hitler was also like right there, and so Hitler would be super intimidating to say no to. So the United States enters the war in a situation where it looks like the Germans, if things go the right way for them, could dominate the entire continent of Europe by knocking Russia out of the war. And if that happens, that increases the difficulty level quite a bit. Now, the reason I lay that groundwork is because shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his military advisor, a guy by the name of General George Marshall, who's kind of the architect for the war effort that the United States plans out, they propose a very controversial plan. They propose that Europe has to be saved first, that the country that attacked the United States, Japan, they can wait, because at the very least, Japan wasn't threatening to knock out one of the major members of the Allied powers. Germany was, and Germany looked more powerful and more dangerous than Japan. And that's actually a very controversial policy, because the millions of Americans who enlisted in the wake of Pearl Harbor enlisted to fight mostly the Japanese Empire. They didn't really enlist, at least at first, to fight the Germans. I mean, it's not because people were in love with Hitler, but just Hitler didn't bomb us on December 7th. But this was a calculated move where Roosevelt and Marshall understood that if America didn't decisively intervene in Europe, there might not be a Europe left to save. And so that's the policy that the United States proposes after war is declared. That being said, things kind of ease up in the Pacific a little bit. Because remember, one of the reasons that Japan declares war on the United States is because it feels militarily inferior, right? It's very vulnerable to economic sanctions, and it attacks the United States, so it has a free hand to invade European colonial possessions throughout East Asia, basically to get cheap gas. And again, it's a very materialistic ploy. They're not going to war really out of ideological conviction. They're going to war because they need resources. And the only power that stands in their way is the United States, which doesn't bode well for Japan's long-term successes, because Japan assumes that if the United States is defeated at Pearl Harbor, it's going to take them a while to recover and react. And actually what happens is that the United States is able to recover and then some at a rate that Japan just doesn't anticipate. So what happens is that there are a few early battles that are, kind of stalemates, kind of ties more or less. You have the Battle of the Coral Sea, in which the Japanese and the U.S. Navy both take casualties. But what happens is that shortly after Pearl Harbor, there is this thought that the United States needs to retaliate against Japan in some way, shape, or form. Something that, makes the United States look strong as opposed to weak. So if Japan is going to bomb our battleships at Pearl Harbor, well, how can we one up that? Well, why not bomb Japan's capital, Tokyo? The problem is it's kind of hard to get to Tokyo, and so a guy by the name of General Doolittle hatches this scheme where I think B-24s are flown off of an aircraft carrier. They fly over Tokyo, basically offload their bombs, which don't really hit that much, and then those bombers are flown to China, where they're promptly ditched. Now, the raid itself, it's called the Doolittle raid, by the way, accomplishes on a material level exactly nothing. It's a failure if you're looking at it in pure material terms. But the Japanese don't look at it in pure material terms, because Tokyo is not just the capital city. It's also where the Emperor Hirohito resides. And for those of you who don't know, in Japanese culture, the emperor isn't just some dude with a fancy hat. The emperor is a god king. He is both the head of state, but also supposedly, according to myth, the emperor of Japan is descended from the Japanese sun goddess Amaterasu. And the emperor realistically doesn't have supreme power in the way that Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin do, but at the same time, people understood that Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin were mere mortals. The Japanese, especially the Japanese military, let's say they were pretty convinced that the emperor was a divine figure to be protected at all costs. The mere fact that the airspace of Tokyo was compromised by the enemy was unacceptable. But what do you do about it? Well, the Japanese military was convinced that this attack wasn't launched by from a carrier, because how could anybody be so redneck to fly a big, I think it's a 2 or 4 engine bomber, I can't remember, off of a comparatively small aircraft carrier? Well, America, that's who. But the Japanese really didn't conceive of that as a possibility. So what they decide to do is they attack the most likely point of origin that the Doolittle raid was launched from. And that is a fairly small naval and air base located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Maybe that's why they called it Midway Atoll, or the Midway Islands. So what Japan decides to do is it sends its carriers with its best pilots. Many of the pilots who bombed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Some of these guys were arguably the best pilots in the world at the time. It takes a tremendous amount of skill and training and time to learn how to take off from, but more importantly, to land on an aircraft carrier. Quite literally, there's not a lot of room for error. So the Japanese Navy sails forth with its 4 big carriers, and at this point, it looks like America's about to get wrecked. But America has one advantage, and that is that even before the war, the United States Navy was able to crack the codes that Japan used for its military, and actually for its diplomats. The fact that Pearl Harbor wasn't detected earlier is kind of a serendipitous tragedy, but the U.S. Navy figures out pretty quickly what's about to happen. And so what happens is that when the Japanese carriers arrive at Midway, they're basically ambushed by the combined U.S. fleet there. It's still a pretty difficult battle, and to be honest, it's a battle where in some parts the United States gets lucky. A few, like a small group of bombers just managed to find some of the Japanese carriers unprotected, and they basically sink them. But in that battle, Japan loses 4 of its carriers and some of its best pilots. And these are guys that you just can't replace. Also, in an air battle that happens a little bit after Midway, the Battle of Guadalcanal, also known as I love this name for it, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan loses its remaining experienced pilots. So, what this means is that Japan's early run of success, and by the way, it had achieved some fairly epic success at the beginning of World War II, but by the Battle of Midway, it kind of grinds to a halt. It doesn't mean that Japan is not threatening, but it does mean that Japan can kind of keep for a while. So, because of that, by January of 1943, Roosevelt and the rest of the Allied leaders decide that it's time to kind of call a war council. And we're going to talk about several of these war councils because they're important, because in these war councils, you have the most powerful individuals in the world coming together, and in many respects, literally carving up the world between them. The first of these conferences is the Casablanca Conference. The Casablanca Conference was attended by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain. There were a few other leaders. You had French, some of the, let's say, the Allied, let me back up. You had a French general by the name of Charles de Gaulle, who becomes the political leader of Free France, who was also at the conference. But what Roosevelt pitches, or rather what Roosevelt's generals pitch, is a quick end to the war in Europe. And that quick end is going to involve the landing of a large American army in France or somewhere in Germany. And at that point, Churchill's like, what? We kind of fought the Germans in France before in 1940, and we did okay. We fought hard, and it didn't work out too well. And so what Churchill and the British are worried about is the Americans, just to be honest, they're kind of like Tigger from Winnie the Pooh. I guess that would make Churchill Winnie the Pooh himself, but Tigger is just very impulsive. He doesn't want to put a lot of thought into whatever it is he's doing. And so the United States wants to end the war and end the war quickly. The British have fought the Germans far longer than the Americans. And actually, the United States agrees to help the British defend some of its possessions in North Africa, most notably Egypt. And when U.S. forces actually participate in some early battles against the Germans, they get their butts handed to them in battles like the Battle of the Kasserine Pass. So what happens is that the British instead propose a different strategy. Not a strategy that involves invading Northern Europe, but going for what is called the soft underbelly. Basically, Churchill and the British pitched the idea that Italy is the third wheel of the Axis powers, that Italy has a glass jaw, and if you hit them just right, they're going to break and shatter. And so the United States and the United Kingdom commit to going after Italy first. Now, that being said, the true significance of Casablanca isn't really realized until a little bit later because Casablanca was supposed to be the moment where final victory was organized, where America was going to sweep in like the Riders of Rohan and just crush all opposition before it, invade Germany, overthrow Hitler, and right off into the sunset. And instead, Roosevelt is kind of caught flat-footed. There's no big announcement, nothing to get people excited over. And so Roosevelt's trying to figure out what he can say other than this is going to be a much longer war than we anticipated. So when he's speaking to journalists, Roosevelt decides to kind of rally the troops a little bit, and he says that the United States will accept nothing other than the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. Think about that. World War I was a very long war. And at the very least, when Germany decided to seek an armistice, they thought they could get a conditional surrender. Germany, if you agree to stop fighting, we can try to work out these 14 points. No territorial annexations. We just go back to the way things were before the war. And if Germany had not been offered that, maybe they would have continued to fight. Unconditional surrender raises the ante because it means for the Axis powers that there are no guarantees. Once you surrender unconditionally, there's no guarantee that the Soviets or the Americans or the British won't take your stuff or maybe just annex Germany outright. So Roosevelt has gotten some criticism for this decision, especially given what we're going to talk about at the very end of the war, because some historians have argued, and some politicians and strategists at the time argued, that this just encouraged the Axis powers to fight longer and fight harder. So that being said, there's one major leader here who is absent. And of course, that leader is Joseph Stalin. And Stalin admittedly has a good excuse because at this point, the military situation in the Soviet Union is critical. Moscow is still safe, but that's about all we can say for the Soviet Union. Then in August of 1942, there's a German army that decides to take an advance on the city of Stalingrad. Why did they decide to advance on the city of Stalingrad? Well, because it had the boss's name in it. Not because it was strategic at all, but it's purely for symbolic value at this point. So German troops get into the city of Stalingrad in the late summer and early fall of 1942. But by the winter of 1942, they can't get out. Soviet armies encircle the German army trapped in Stalingrad. And eventually, in a battle that lasts almost 6 to 7 months, the German army surrenders to the Soviet Union. And these are just some of the scenes of just how horrible the conditions were. I should have showed you guys like a few images of just how gutted the city of Stalingrad was from 6 to 7 months of fighting. But nearly 600,000 German troops surrendered, and it also included a lot of Germany's armored tanks, which is, let's say that was always kind of Germany's wild card. They're effective and very modern and advanced tanks. So This doesn't mean that Germany is on its last legs exactly. Germany is still powerful, but it's kind of like the Battle of Midway in Europe. It ensures that going forward, Germany is going to be more or less on the defensive for most of the rest of the war. So this gives the Allied powers some breathing room. So in December of 1943, there's another conference, and this is a conference where the big three, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, just come together for the first time. Um, in the Tehran conference, Joseph Stalin is sort of fresh from his victory at Stalingrad, but the Soviet Union is grinding forward and losing literally millions of people trying to counterattack into German-held territory in Eastern Europe. And Joseph Stalin is like, hey, look at what I did at Stalingrad. It's a nice name, Stalingrad. And the Soviet people have suffered much. And how has America suffered? How has Britain suffered? Oh, that's right. You are fighting Italians and fascist French people in North Africa and Italy. So Stalin puts pressure on the United States and Great Britain, actually kind of guilts them into launching a second front. In other words, that invasion into Europe that the United States first proposed at Casablanca, Joseph Stalin pushes for that. And part of that is that the Soviets are taking such extraordinary casualties that Stalin is savvy enough to know that the Soviet Union is going to need some relief there. So, also, it's kind of awkward because remember, you have Winston Churchill, who was an arch anti-communist before the war, and you have Joseph Stalin, who is basically a communist dictator. And even though they were kind of friends, the relationship between the two was always awkward. Apparently, at some point, Stalin makes this pitch. Well, why don't we just simply execute 50,000 or 100,000 German officers? If they have no officers, they have no war. And apparently, Churchill did not like that at all, and Roosevelt, oblivious to Churchill's frustration, said, "Well, maybe 49,000 instead of 50,000 would be enough." Apparently, Churchill just decides that the mere thought of executing professional military officers was outrageous, and he just storms out of the meeting. Stalin goes out into the hallway, consoles Churchill, and says, "Oh, it's okay, I'm just joking." But Churchill isn't sure. Churchill thinks that Stalin is maybe just kind of testing the water to see what he could get by with. And he might have been onto something there, as we'll kind of see. So that's the Tehran Conference. You have an American commitment to open a second front, a second real front in Europe, not just fighting in North Africa and Italy, the soft underbelly, as Churchill called it. On June 6th, 1944, that second front was open. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada all simultaneously landed armies along the northern coast of France. It's a logistical feat that is almost unprecedented. Years of planning was invested in this, and it was a tough day. So on D-Day, the day that marks the beginning of the initial landings into Northern Europe, you had cases like the landing of Omaha Beach, in which you had German machine gun bunkers that were sort of perched on the top of cliffs that just rained down fire on American GIs as they were wading out through the surf. For those of you who are kind of curious and don't mind a nightmare or two and have parents who are cool with it, you might want to watch like the first 30 minutes of the film Saving Private Ryan, which is a fairly, from what I've been told, authentic portrayal of what that battle was basically like. But you see all the horrors of war, but you also see, I think, kind of what makes America's war effort so successful. Just look at the sheer scale of this landing. I'm not sure if there are any in this picture, but the Americans invested so much thought and planning into this that they actually helped design and build with the British artificial harbors that could be towed from the southern coast of England all the way to the coast of France. And here's the amazing thing. Despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of troops waded to shore on June 6, 1944, and eventually millions more would arrive in France in the next couple of days and weeks, the Germans were taken completely by surprise. And they were taken completely by surprise because the Americans made the Germans believe that they were naturally going to invade across the English Channel at the shortest point into the region called Calais, because that's the sensible option. You only have to go 20 miles or so as opposed to 80. And you can also kind of attack on short notice. And so that's precisely why American Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower decides not to do that and instead to do the unexpected, to basically land in the Normandy area of France. The Germans don't see it coming. They are so convinced that the Americans are going to land in Calais that even as American troops are wading ashore, Hitler tells his general, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, well, the Americans aren't going to attack in Normandy. This is obviously just a clever ruse. They're obviously going to send troops across the English Channel. And so Hitler refuses to authorize a counterattack, and the troops come ashore until, of course, for Hitler, he has the dawning realization that the quote-unquote feint or ruse is actually the real thing. And to be honest, that is, in some respects, the most difficult part about the war in Europe. Once you get an army ashore, once you successfully transport an army across the English Channel, it's going to be difficult to dislodge. I should also introduce formally the American Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, think about that term, that title, Supreme Commander. I mean, don't you want that on your resume? Was Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in World War II. In fact, with that title, with that job, you open a lot of doors. In fact, you might open any door, even the door to the presidency. And what I'll say for Eisenhower is he has this, almost politician's charm. Here he is, by the way, kind of socializing and chilling out with members of the 101st Airborne Division right before they go off into battle. Right in the hours before D-Day. But Eisenhower kind of portrays this golly all shucks persona. He's easy, almost silly, But I think this tells you a little bit about him. He is a fairly canny person. At West Point, they said that he wasn't necessarily the brightest student academically, which is hard at West Point, but he was an exceptional poker player and knew when to bluff. And those are useful skills as a politician, too. All right, so that being said, once the U.S. Army lands in Northern Europe, I would love to say that, it's never a good thing for a history teacher or a historian to say that the end is inevitable. Of course, just the fact that the U.S. Army lands in France doesn't mean that Hitler's days are numbered. But because the United States had such an overwhelming superiority in industrial production, in numbers and firepower, it's hard to imagine a scenario in which the United States could lose the war, let alone get pushed out of Europe. The Germans actually tried. In December of 1945, the German army launched an offensive in the middle of winter to try to push the American and British armies into the sea. And they came pretty close. They basically punched an enormous hole or bulge into the Allied lines, which, by the way, is why it's called the Battle of the Bulge. It's not a weight loss scheme, by the way. At least it wasn't at first. But the Germans come very close, but not close enough. Because once the winter weather lifts, American air superiority comes in, and all of those fancy tanks get bombed to smithereens. So it looks like for everybody, the end of the war is in sight. So we have another Allied conference, this time in Yalta, which is a Soviet resort village in the Crimea. Right before Yalta, by the way, Roosevelt is up for re-election. He has to run for a fourth term. And at this point, Roosevelt is a shoo-in because now that American forces are firmly in Europe, now that the United States seems to have an advantage over Japan, and now that the United States is firmly out of the Depression, Roosevelt wins overwhelmingly. I should note that many of Roosevelt's closest advisors are aware of the fact that his health seems to be declining. Now, that's kind of important in terms of how we explain what happens in Yalta. In the Yalta Conference, you have a very different type of conference. This isn't a conference that is really trying to plan out let's say, a way to win the war, because the war already looks won by this point. It's just a matter of time. The question is, what is the world going to look like after the end of World War II? And all of the sides, all of the factions have pretty strong opinions on that point. Remember, Churchill and Roosevelt signed the Atlantic Charter, which basically spelled out their vision of a post-war world. The world of Woodrow Wilson, a world in which is structured around the idea of self-determination and freedom and human rights. A world in which international organizations like the United Nations play a strong role. And a world in which there are no territorial annexations. Well, tell that to Joseph Stalin. Because remember, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, they are a party to the Second World War because Hitler invaded them. Winston Churchill. The United Kingdom went to war in 1939 because German troops invaded their ally, Poland. But remember, Soviet troops also invaded Poland. And as the Soviet army gets closer and closer to Germany, they start rolling into Eastern European cities like Warsaw. Um, in Warsaw, there is this very ferocious uprising as Soviet troops get closer to the city, where the people rise up to try to overthrow the German garrison. And at that point, Soviet tanks grind to a halt and let the uprising peter out. And once there's a lot of dead people and the uprising stops, Soviet troops move forward and take the city. And this is because Stalin would like nothing more than for the Germans and the rioters to just kill each other. Because in his mind, those Polish rioters might be a liability once Soviet troops move into the city. And the thing is that for Winston Churchill, because remember, for the British, this was a war about the freedom and independence of small states like Poland. Winston Churchill is becoming very suspicious about whether or not the Soviet Union is going to allow Eastern European states to basically go back to the way they were before the war. Remember, in Eastern Europe, you don't have, let's say, much of an appetite for the Soviet Union or for communism as an ideology. But what happens is that Stalin commits to elections in Poland and Eastern Europe in general. But also remember, Stalin is that person who said famously, it doesn't matter who votes, it matters who does the counting. So just let that be a little bit of context here. So the Allied powers also agree that Germany will be divided up into 4 zones. A zone held by the United States, one by the Soviet Union, one by the United Kingdom, and finally one by France. So that's kind of what happens. You have a roadmap for what's going to happen to Germany after the war, in which it's going to be temporarily occupied. And then you also have at least a commitment from Stalin to have free and fair elections in Europe. It should be noted that Winston Churchill, who was so vital to rallying British morale in the Battle of Britain, at this point in the war, he kind of checks out. In his mind, he's not really so much concerned about how the war against Hitler is going to go. He's much more worried about Joseph Stalin and the threat of communism. And he's also very frustrated because for his part, Roosevelt doesn't seem to think he's a problem. Roosevelt seems to think that Stalin is somebody who's honest and can be trusted. And so Churchill, we think of Churchill as being this leader who gets this great comeuppance at the end of the war, this leader who decides not to surrender, and in fact helps defeat Nazi Germany. But the tragedy of Churchill is that Churchill ends the Second World War deeply dispirited and almost despairing, because in his mind, the very reason that Britain went to war, the fate of Poland, is not going to be resolved. And in fact, Churchill is so worried about Soviet intentions that he authorizes the Army General Staff to draw up plans called Operation Unthinkable, in which British forces attack Soviet forces and roll back Soviet control of Eastern Europe. Well, the British General Staff ruled that Operation Unthinkable was unthinkable. And the reason for this is that the Soviet Union has just grown too strong. The British Empire has been too weakened by the war. There's no way that Great Britain can fight and contain the spread of communism alone. The only way that's going to happen is if the British get an ally who can help them. Maybe the United States at some point. I'm not saying that this is one of those Cold War moments, but this is one of those Cold War moments, which is why I took some time here. So Roosevelt goes back to the United States, and at this point, his health deteriorates a little bit further. And so on April 12th, 1945, the unthinkable happens. Roosevelt, just months before, actually 1 month before the end of the war in Europe, Roosevelt dies. He dies in Warm Springs, Georgia, awkwardly in the company of his daughter and his mistress. Um, that's kind of like, I don't know, that's a story for another time. But, um, you know, the thing is that Roosevelt has been president for 3 full terms, and he was elected to a fourth. There are many Americans who have grown up knowing no other president but Roosevelt. The guy's got big shoes to fill. And I would love to tell you that there was somebody waiting in the wings ready to fill those shoes, but that never happens with vice presidents because vice presidents aren't picked because they're good at filling shoes. Vice presidents are picked because they help their boss get elected, but aren't impressive enough to directly threaten their boss's hold on power. So Roosevelt is this northern aristocrat. And so, what he decides to do to spread his appeal throughout the country is he picks a former shoe salesman from Missouri, Harry Truman. Harry Truman had appeal in both the South and the West. He was a supporter of the New Deal. But Truman had really no foreign policy experience. And Roosevelt didn't really even talk to the guy. I mean, you can basically count the occasions on one hand in which they met while Roosevelt was president. Last time in American history, we talked, last time, or you might remember during the Civil War, we talked about the fact that wars are pretty simple. The complicated questions are always what happens during peacetime. And when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at the end of the Civil War, we got a very inexperienced Andrew Johnson. Fortunately, the United States has a very different experience with Harry Truman. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. I said that Hitler was bright, but bright doesn't equal rational. So when Roosevelt dies, Hitler is overjoyed because this is in April of 1945, and at this point, Soviet forces are circling around Berlin. And Hitler is a student of history, but yet he has this romanticized and cherry-picked version of history. His version of history is the history of how Germany is awesome at everything and can defeat anyone. And Hitler remembers that in another point in German history, there was another king by the name of Frederick the Great, who was encircled by many different foes, Russia, Austria, France. And during the 7 Years' War, or remember, that's the old French and Indian War, it looked as though Germany was going to be defeated. Yes, Lance, I know we're talking about Prussia, but don't worry about it. And so, serendipitously, at the very end of the war, the Empress of Russia dies and is replaced by somebody who deeply admires the German king. And so the Russians decide to just leave the war. And so that forces France and Austria, Germany's other enemies, to reluctantly make peace with Germany, which means that Germany wins that war because of this random chance encounter. And Hitler assumes that it's going to be more of the same. This is history repeating itself. And this is why I hate that Santayana quote, because usually the people who use it misuse it quite a bit or derive the wrong lessons from it. Because in this case, history does not repeat. The Soviets, the Americans, and the British still continue their inexorable drive towards the heartland of Germany. And on May 8th, 1945, Soviet troops successfully take the city of Berlin. And VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, is celebrated. And it's, I mean, just look at the devastation that you see. Berlin, by the way, had been bombed almost nonstop from 1940 until the very end of the war. And no, by the way, Hitler does not live in Argentina. The Soviets found him in a bunker, and or I think the Soviets found him in a bunker and decided to destroy the remains. But that's gotten the conspiracy theorists talking ever since. Hitler, by the way, committed suicide before he was actually captured. That being said, it's at this point that we start talking about two kind of separate phases. We have to wrap up the war in East Asia, but this is also where we can really start to talk about the Cold War emerging. We can definitely see that there's a breakdown between at least Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. So let me pause right quick and move ahead. So, what is the Cold War? It's a struggle between two coalitions, two armed camps, one led by the United States and the other led by the Soviet Union. The United States becomes a symbol of not just American culture, but it also becomes a symbol of liberal political values, of democracy, and free market capitalism. The Soviet Union becomes a symbol of political communism and economic socialism. So what this kind of tells you is that the way that the Cold War is viewed is not as just simply a fight between competing countries, but competing ideologies. And we'll talk a little bit about whether that's true or not. There's a few different ways you can kind of look at the Cold War, especially since it goes on for such a long time. So what happens is that after Berlin is taken, the big three meet for one last time. And actually, to be honest, it's Yalta that's the last time, because now FDR has passed away. So the big three, less Roosevelt, meet in the center of Germany, Potsdam. By the way, for those of you who don't know, if you remember the French the French Palace of Versailles, Potsdam is to Germany as Versailles is to France. It's kind of like the symbol of old traditional German Prussian militarism and imperialism. So, in other words, there is some trolling going on, I think, with the location this big. But what happens is that at Potsdam, there is a couple things going on. One, the Americans specifically want Soviet help with Japan. And we'll talk a little bit about why the war with Japan had kind of stalemated to a certain extent. And remember, the British are still deeply concerned about the fact that Stalin has promised free and fair elections, but that hasn't happened. The Red Army has dug in across Eastern Europe. Local communist parties start to emerge in places like Poland, Greece, Yugoslavia, just all across the board. And the thing is that communism was deeply unpopular in most of those states. So the assumption was that those communist organizations that were taking power had to have some backing by the Soviet Union, which doesn't sound like free or fair elections to me. So you have this impasse. Um, Stalin um, agrees to relinquish military control of Eastern Europe, but he's made those same promises at Tehran, right? And the thing is that there's this old adage that possession is 9/10 of the law. In other words, it doesn't really matter what somebody says or what somebody has the right to do. What matters is what somebody has. And so long as the Soviets had the army in Eastern Europe, there really wasn't much the British or the Americans could do, because the Soviet army by this point was the largest military force in the world, possibly in human history. So at this point, Truman decides to take on a more aggressive approach to basically convince the Soviet Union to back down in Eastern Europe. Um, so in the Potsdam Conference, as things kind of reach an impasse, there's an aide that walks into the room and delivers Truman a handwritten note. Truman reads it and puts it in his pocket. Truman, for his part, had been kind of conciliatory and passive before he received the note. But after he received that note, Truman almost has a personality change. He tells Stalin that the Soviet army will relinquish control of Eastern Europe, that there will be free and fair elections, or else. Or else what? And apparently, some of Stalin's closest aides, his foreign minister Molotov, once Truman started talking to Stalin in that way, Molotov almost went into a catatonic state. Nobody had talked to Stalin like that and lived. And Molotov knew that from personal experience, by the way. He had seen a lot of purges and a lot of political rivals eliminated. And so Molotov is just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Stalin, for his part, is kind of curious. And Truman goes on to explain that the United States of America has tested a new weapon of unbelievable power: the atomic bomb. In mid-1945, the United States and its allies, to a certain extent, had unlocked the power of nuclear fission, where basically a neutron is fired into the atom of either plutonium or uranium, which produces this chain reaction resulting in a fireball that is literally hotter than the surface of the sun when it's unleashed. This came about because of the Manhattan Project. This is actually, if you look at the Second World War, the Manhattan Project is the single most expensive thing that the United States had ever spent money on. It's more expensive than aircraft carriers. It's more expensive than anything. And it was the result of cooperation from scientists all over the world. And what's really interesting is that, I've mentioned that Hitler fights World War II because of his racial ideology, and he loses World War II because of his racial ideology. Because if you look at many of the scientists who work on the Manhattan Project, so many were scientists originally from Germany or Europe in general who fled Germany either because they were political dissidents or they were members of a persecuted class, especially Jews. Names like von Neumann, Teller, and even Einstein himself helped work on some parts of the Manhattan Project. Now, Truman is, loudly proclaims the fact that the United States has, discovered an energy source of unprecedented power. The thing is that Joseph Stalin is very canny. He already knows all about the Manhattan Project because Soviet intelligence, the NKVD, later known as the KGB, had infiltrated the Manhattan Project. And actually, Stalin knew more about the Manhattan Project than Truman did when he was vice president. So Stalin simply replies, well, the Soviet Union congratulates the United States on its new technical achievement and hopes that it will be used to bring the war to a speedier conclusion. Joseph Stalin pledges that Soviet forces will help the United States defeat Japan. Now, the question is, what role does the atomic bomb play in forcing Japan to surrender? And of course, why do we use it? You might remember at the Casablanca Conference that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had declared that the United States will accept nothing more than unconditional surrender from Japan. And what happens is that as U.S. forces sweep across the Pacific, liberating or occupying islands held by the Japanese military, like Iwo Jima or Tarawa, Guadalcanal. As U.S. forces get closer to the Japanese home islands, the Japanese start to use much more aggressive tactics. As U.S. forces near Japan, the Japanese military used tactics like kamikaze attacks, where Japanese pilots would fly their aircraft into American and other Allied warships. You also have famed banzai charges, where Japanese troops facing inevitable defeat would basically just charge forward in a human wave attack. Now, generally, these attacks weren't really all that effective, but they were designed to prove a point that if the United States wanted unconditional surrender, this is what they were going to have to pay for to get it. You're going to have to experience kamikaze attacks, banzai attacks, and as a country, I guess if we're talking about Japan, we are so dedicated to final victory that we're willing to give our lives for it. Are you? So this is kind of a problem. At the very end of the Pacific War, actually, it kind of overlaps with the Potsdam Conference. The United States military decides to invade the island of Okinawa. Okinawa isn't part of Japan, but it's been occupied by Japan since, I think, the 1700s. And it has a sizable population. Most of the islands that were fought over in the Pacific War were very, very small. Okinawa, I think, at its widest point, it's like 100 miles or so wide. It might be a little bigger than, smaller than that. But that gives you an idea. It wasn't just some deserted island out in the middle of the Pacific. So what happens is Japanese forces resist ferociously. And it becomes the bloodiest battle for the United States in the entirety of World War II. The United States military takes some 20,000 casualties, including the commanding officer. It's the only time in World War II where the United States loses a commanding officer in battle. But that didn't prepare Americans for what happened at the end of the battle. Many of the Japanese civilians um, decided that after American troops took the island, they would pay for that dishonor by committing mass suicide. And so you have really horrible and chilling photographs of Japanese civilians going to the cliffs that sort of are kind of found throughout the island, and they would all jump en masse. And hundreds of people died this way. And Okinawa is just a small province of the Japanese Empire. And so, if that's what awaits Americans in Okinawa, if that's just a taste of what the invasion of Japan is going to look like, then what's that going to be like? Um, at the time, the United States was planning for the amphibious invasion of Japan, which would have dwarfed D-Day by an order of magnitude. And the United States War Department anticipated that an invasion of Japan would result in, at minimum, over 1 million casualties for the United States alone, and an even larger number for the Japanese. So the thing is that today we look at the atomic bomb as the use of the atomic bomb as a situation with profound moral consequences. Like, how can you just kind of casually nuke somebody? And I would love to tell you that most people kind of agonized over it, but this is where context is kind of important. If you look at the um, atomic bomb, it was a considerable bomb, but when it's dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, um, something like 140,000 people in total are killed. And I mean, and you can't underplay that. However, if you look at conventional mass bombings, like the one that occurred in Tokyo in the same year, where you have actually more people die in that than die with in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Um, so really, what happens is that for Truman, it's kind of morally, it's a non-dilemma. Truman authorizes the use of atomic weapons on the Japanese home islands so that maybe Japan would decide to surrender rather than fight to the death. What's kind of chilling to think about is that the United States military actually had to do some sleuthing to find a city to bomb because there weren't many cities left in Japan, because that's how extensive the bombing campaigns had been. Tokyo had basically been obliterated in a mass firestorm. The only cities that were really left were the cities of Kyoto, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. And the only reason Kyoto was spared is because FDR's Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, had apparently spent his honeymoon in Kyoto and understood that it was this ancient cultural and historic center and just couldn't contemplate using atomic bombs on Kyoto, even though it was a much larger city. So eventually, the United States military drops 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And right around the same time, Soviet forces invade Japanese-held possessions in northern China, specifically that puppet state that we talked about, Manchuria. And so the combination of those twin, or I guess those 3 major hits, forces not the Japanese government, which is controlled by the military, but the emperor himself, to demand that the Japanese government surrender to the Allies. The Japanese emperor actually sends a radio broadcast across the country and says that we have to endure the unendurable. For most Japanese people, this is the first time they'd ever heard their emperor speak. And it's something that causes that perception that the emperor is like a god or a divine figure to kind of fade away, because the Japanese really don't view him today as a divine figure. That being said, just kind of get an idea of how destructive um, the atomic bombs actually were. Basically, this is an image of Ground Zero. This is actually a hospital, the superstructure of a hospital, and you can kind of see that the walls are just completely blown out. Most of the buildings within the blast radius were just instantly incinerated. And just to give you an idea of what you're looking at during the Cold War, if you look at um, the bomb used at Nagasaki, this is about a yield. It's about 10 kilotons. Now, in comparison, this is this gives you an idea of what the hydrogen bomb was like used during the Cold War. You go from 10 kilotons to 10 megatons at the low end. And by the way, so this is the test that was done at the Bikini Atoll, not to be confused with Bikini Bottom. For comparison, so these are this is the Hiroshima bomb right here. Then at the extreme end, this gives you an idea of how powerful the most powerful hydrogen bombs could be. This is the Tsar bomb that was dropped by the Soviet Union, I think in the late 1960s. They basically sent a large Soviet bomber into the upper atmosphere, almost into space itself, quite honestly. They dropped the bomb, and the bomb was so powerful that the bomber that dropped it was almost destroyed. And again, what's important to remember is that at the end of the Second World War, once Japan surrenders, there's this perception held by many Americans that war has been made obsolete by the atomic bomb. Armies have been made obsolete by atomic bombs, because what good is a rifle against that? And this is also an age in which the United States enjoys a nuclear monopoly. And so the kind of ambivalent attitude that the United States has about Joseph Stalin, at least immediately after the war, is because Americans know that this is the ace up their sleeve. But because Joseph Stalin has infiltrated the Manhattan Project, that nuclear monopoly lasts just a few years, and then the Soviet Union is able to develop an atomic bomb of its own. So now that the Second World War is over, let's talk about what the United States does to ensure that another similar conflict doesn't happen again. Hopefully you're getting some deja vu with the fact that the United States tried to do something similar with World War I, and it didn't really work all that well. After World War II, however, isolationism has been gutted. You don't have that same kind of sense of ambivalence. More Americans die in World War II than in World War I. In the Second World War, the United States loses almost 400,000 people, but it's a war in which Nazism is eliminated as a political force in Germany. Fascist parties are more or less eliminated throughout Europe. And the United States is a clear winner in the conflict. So what happens is that the United States kind of starts almost shaping the world in its own image. It changes the diplomatic system, and it also changes the economic system that kind of binds the world together. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I think a little bit goes a long way. But what happens is that senior British and American diplomats and economists, including, by the way, John Maynard Keynes, meet at a hotel in Bretton Woods, Connecticut. And what they basically are going to do is discuss how the post-war economic system is going to work. And this isn't just kind of like an abstract academic economics lesson. Remember that there was a widespread perception that the Great Depression itself had led to the emergence of fascism and communism and the emergence of individuals like Hitler. So how do you prevent that? Well, you prevent that, one, by pegging all currencies around the world to the dollar. The dollar becomes the currency that basically provides the foundation for the global economic system. That doesn't last too long. That doesn't last, and that basically expires in the 1970s. But you can kind of see that the United States is becoming the economic center of the world, if it wasn't already. You also have the establishment of organizations that are designed to kind of keep countries stable. You have the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that provides loans to impoverished nations. And you also have the World Bank that also sort of directly deals with issues related to global poverty and development. Now, these are international charities, but they're based in the United States and kind of created by the United States. By the way, the same thing kind of applies for the United Nations. I know that we kind of think of this as an international organization, and if you grew up like I did in the 1990s, there were all these conspiracy theories about UN black helicopters and how the UN was going to, become a one world government. But the reality is that the United Nations is a byproduct of the United States. I mean, we wrote the UN Charter, more or less. And so the United Nations, by the way, is basically, if you look at the structure, by the way, it basically becomes the replacement for the League of Nations, and not much has changed, including the creation of a Security Council with 5 permanent members that can veto anything. And by the way, that also kind of shows you something else, that the United States isn't really thinking about a future Cold War at this point, because when the United States and the Soviet Union both get on the Security Council, it's during the Cold War. And because the US and the USSR can veto anything, it basically means that nothing gets done in the United Nations during the Cold War. In some respects, it's just as ineffective as the League of Nations is. At least you can make that argument. One other point. We talked about that the issue of autarky and the fact that during the Great Depression, you have the creation of tariffs around the same time that countries need or should have abandoned tariffs. So what happens is that there is an agreement called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And I'll give you the short version of what that means. So the agreement is to not have tariffs, and the agreement is to have trade. And this eventually leads to the creation of the World Trade Organization, a group of nations that are philosophically supposed to object to the existence of tariffs. And so now what kind of happens is that you see the reemergence of that argument against the tariff, that old sort of time-honored institution in U.S. history, that the tariff isn't just bad economics, it's bad politics, it's bad diplomacy, because the tariff arguably led to war. That being said, you also see a few other ways in which the United States has dramatically changed. Part of it is because of the Second World War, and part of it is because of the Cold War. But remember that um, there's a consensus that um, a terrible economic climate leads to political instability. Well, Europe is still pretty unstable because there's a lot of economic malaise. What happens, I'm going to go forward just a second, is that the United States decides that it's not going to retreat inward like it did after the First World War. It's actually going to take steps to ensure that European economies are stable. And there's kind of a self-centered logic here. So if the United States gives Western European nations, well, actually just European nations in general, um, a um, a large lump sum in aid, um, that also helps the United States because the United States is an industrial power and it also depends a lot on overseas exports. And the thing is that if European nations are still struggling with the aftermath of the Second World War, well, they're not going to be able to buy anything. So the argument is, why not? It's almost like Keynesianism at its best. So why not give um, the war-torn nations of Europe a few $1 billion in aid. Then, whenever they need commodities to recover, who are they going to turn to? Well, the only game in town, the only industrialized nation that's emerged from the Second World War unscathed, the United States. And so the argument is that Americans are going to see that money in aid again. Um, what also happens is that the United States agrees to defend Germany and Japan from the get-go because it was just too controversial for them to have militaries at this point. What the Germans and the Japanese do is they basically take all that money that would have been spent on defense and they invest it in their industries, particularly their automotive industries. And in the 1980s, Americans are shocked when companies like Ford and Chrysler and General Motors face stiff overseas competition from companies like Honda and Mercedes, BMW, etc. But anyway, what happens, at least in the short term, is that the United States emerges from the Second World War more powerful than ever, and it literally shapes the world in its own image. Free market capitalism, Keynesian economics, they kind of become the order of the day. And also, what happens is that you see this post-war economic boom that lasts until really the late 1960s. If there is a point in world history where the United States is at its most powerful and most influential, it's this. And the question is, what is it going to do with this power? And the answer is fight the Cold War.